The late afternoon sky over the outskirts of Boston had turned the color of old pewter, heavy and low, the kind of sky that seemed to press down on the earth, as though asking it to hold something heavier than it could bear. The trees along the cemetery's iron fence had already shed most of their leaves, leaving only a tangle of dark branches against the gray, like cracks in a pale wall. A black car moved slowly along the gravel path that wound between the headstones, its engine barely audible, its presence as quiet and deliberate as a held breath. The driver pulled to a stop near the older section of the grounds, where the monuments were larger and the grass between them grew with a kind of undisturbed calm. The door opened, and a woman stepped out, tall, composed, dressed in a charcoal coat that fell to her knees, her dark hair pinned back with the precision of someone who had learned long ago that the world watched her even when she did not want to be seen. She carried a bouquet of white flowers, fresh and simple, the kind that asked nothing of the person who received them. Her name was Evelyn Carter. She was 51 years old, the chairman of Carter Holdings, one of the most closely watched names in American finance, and she had been coming to this cemetery every month for 7 years. She knew the path by heart. She knew exactly how many steps it took from the gravel road to the stone that bore her husband's name. She had counted them in the early months, when counting was the only thing that kept her moving forward. But today, when she rounded the gentle curve in the path and lifted her eyes to the familiar gray marble, she stopped walking. There was someone already there. A man stood before Michael Carter's grave, his head slightly bowed, his shoulders carrying the quiet posture of someone in genuine prayer or genuine grief. She could not immediately tell which. He was not dressed expensively. His coat was a plain dark wool, worn at the elbows, and his boots were scuffed in the way that working men's boots always are. Beside him, holding his hand with the unconscious trust of a child who has never needed to think about it, stood a little girl of perhaps 10 years old, her red wool hat pulled low over her ears, her free hand clutching a small bundle of wildflowers, daisies and goldenrod, and something purple Evelyn could not name from that distance. The man placed his own flowers against the base of the headstone with both hands, slowly, as though setting down something fragile. For a moment, he was perfectly still. Then he straightened and removed his hat, holding it against his chest. Evelyn stood watching him from 20 feet away. And for a brief moment, she felt something strange move through her, not anger, not yet, but the disorientation of finding another person's grief occupying the exact space where she had always kept her own. She walked forward, her heels quiet on the grass. "Excuse me," she said, keeping her voice even. The man turned. He was perhaps 45, with a broad, weathered face and dark eyes that registered no surprise at seeing her, only a careful, watchful stillness. "This is my husband's grave," Evelyn said. She did not say it harshly, but she said it with the certainty of a woman who had long since stopped softening her statements unnecessarily. Did you know him?" The man looked at the headstone, then back at her. Something moved in his expression, something that looked like the particular combination of relief and apprehension that comes from having waited a very long time to do something difficult. "Mrs. Carter," he said. His voice was low and measured. "My name is Daniel Hayes, and, yes, I knew Michael." He paused. "He saved my life." Evelyn Carter had built her professional life on the ability to remain composed in the presence of shocking information. She had sat across from government regulators, hostile board members, and grieving investors without allowing her face to betray the calculations happening behind it. But standing in that cemetery, in the gray afternoon light, with a stranger saying her dead husband's name as though it belonged to him too, she felt the composure shift slightly, like a floor that had given an inch. She studied the man's face. He did not look like someone who had wandered to the wrong grave by accident. He did not look confused or embarrassed. He looked like a man who had been carrying something for a very long time and had finally found the place to put it down. "Michael Carter," she said carefully. "My husband." "Yes, ma'am," Daniel Hayes said, and then he said Michael's name again, but differently, a shorter version. A nickname, something affectionate and unguarded that only people who had actually known him ever used. It was a name that only a handful of people in the world had called him, and Evelyn had not heard it spoken aloud in 7 years. The sound of it hit her somewhere below the ribs. She had first met Michael Carter at a charity dinner in Cambridge when she was 26 and he was 30. He had not known who she was. That alone had been remarkable. He had talked to her for 2 hours about infrastructure policy and the history of railroads and a novel he had recently read about time and memory, and at the end of the evening he had asked for her number in a way that suggested he genuinely did not know whether she would give it to him. She had. They were married 3 years later in a small ceremony in Vermont, before the company had grown large enough to attract cameras to everything they did. Those early years were the ones she held most carefully, because in them she could still remember what it felt like to be known rather than observed. Michael had grown into a serious man, a thoughtful, quietly influential figure in the world of private investment. But he had kept, beneath all of that, the warmth and the curiosity that had made her fall in love with him in that first conversation. He was not the kind of man who spoke about himself generously or sought attention for the things he did well. He preferred to watch. He preferred to listen. He had a habit, she remembered now, of asking people questions that no one else had thought to ask them, and then sitting with the answers as though they deserved real consideration. She had loved this about him, even when it sometimes made her feel that she was living beside a mystery she had not fully solved. He died on a Tuesday morning in November, 7 years ago. When the small charter plane carrying him and 4 colleagues from Boston to a conference in New York encountered mechanical failure 20 minutes after takeoff, there were no survivors. Evelyn had been in a board meeting when the call came. She had excused herself, walked to the restroom, stood at the sink for 4 minutes, and then returned to the room and finished the meeting. She had not known what else to do. The grief had come later, in waves and ambushes, at moments she could not predict or prepare for. It had arrived during an ordinary Tuesday lunch at a gas station in February, in the middle of a conference call that had nothing to do with anything personal. It was not the dramatic grief of films, it was the kind that lived inside routine, that hid inside the most ordinary moments and erupted from them without warning. She had thrown herself into work because work was the only language she still spoke fluently. She did not remarry. She did not have children. She had the company, and she had these monthly visits to this gray marble stone, and she had the careful, disciplined life she had built around the shape of his absence. She had believed, for 7 years, that she understood the full geography of her loss. She had thought she knew where all the edges were. She had thought she knew him completely. That was what she believed, standing in that cemetery, watching Daniel Hayes bow his head over Michael's grave. She had thought the 7 years of grief and memory and careful reconstruction had given her a complete picture of the man she had loved. She was about to discover how wrong she was. "How did he save your life?" she asked. Her voice was quieter now. The little girl, Lily, she would learn, was watching her with the frank, unguarded curiosity of a child who has not yet learned that staring is impolite, and Evelyn found herself unable to look away from those watchful eyes for more than a moment. Daniel glanced down at his daughter, then back at Evelyn. "That's a longer story than I can tell standing up," he said, "but I should also tell you I have something that belongs to you. I've had it for a long time. I wasn't able to find you. Or maybe I wasn't ready." He reached into his coat. "I brought it today because it's the anniversary, and because I thought if there was ever a day to finally do this right, it was today." He paused. "It's in my car. Would you give me a moment?" Evelyn said nothing for a beat. Then she nodded once, and Daniel Hayes walked back toward the road, Lily trotting alongside him, her wildflowers still gripped in one small fist. Evelyn stood alone before Michael's grave and looked at the headstone and felt the afternoon grow very still around her, as though the world itself were waiting to see what would happen next. Daniel returned, carrying a wooden box. It was about the size of a shoebox, made of dark walnut, worn smooth at the corners from age and handling. He held it with both hands, carefully, the way you carry something that has been in your keeping for so long that it has begun to feel like a responsibility rather than an object. He set it gently on the flat top of the nearby stone bench and stepped back, giving Evelyn room to approach it on her own terms. "Michael gave this to me about 8 months before the accident," Daniel said. He told me that if anything ever happened to him, I should get it to you. He was very specific about that. He didn't explain why he had it, or why he was giving it to me for safekeeping, rather than leaving it somewhere you'd find it. I just said I would do it. He ran a hand over the back of his neck. For a while after the crash, I tried to reach you, but you were very visible, and I was not. I sent a letter to your company that I don't think ever got past a receptionist. Then, some things happened in my own life, and I moved out of state, and the years went by. He looked at the box. I never stopped meaning to do it. I want you to know that. Evelyn stood before the box for a moment without moving. Then she reached out and lifted the lid. Inside, arranged with the deliberate care of someone who had thought about what another person would need to understand, were 3 things. The first was a watch, Michael's old watch, the one he had worn in the early years of their marriage. A simple silver piece his father had given him. She had thought it was lost in the accident. She had grieved for it specifically, which had surprised her at the time, the peculiar intensity of mourning an object. She picked it up and felt its weight in her palm and said nothing. The second was a photograph, printed on regular paper, slightly faded, a photo of Michael at what appeared to be a barbecue or backyard gathering, laughing, his arm around the shoulders of a younger man she did not recognize. The younger man was laughing too. They both looked surprised by whoever was taking the picture, caught in an unguarded moment of genuine ease. The third was a sealed envelope, cream-colored, sealed with wax, her name written on the front in Michael's handwriting. Just her name, Evelyn. Not Mrs. Carter. Not E. Just her name. In the hand she had loved for 23 years. She stood holding it for a long time before she opened it. The letter inside was 4 pages long, written in the careful, slightly cramped script Michael had always used when he was trying to be precise. It was dated approximately 9 months before he died, which meant he had written it in the late winter before the accident, before there had been any known reason to expect anything to happen. He began by saying that he was not ill and was not afraid of dying in any particular or imminent way. He simply wanted her to know certain things, and he had found that he was better at writing them than saying them aloud, even after all the years of saying everything else. He told her that he had been imperfect in ways she might not have known about. Not in the ways that wounded, he was careful to say that, and she believed him, but in the way that men sometimes are who find it easier to act than to explain themselves. He had done things quietly, he said, for years, that he had never mentioned to her, not because he wanted to keep secrets, but because he had grown up with a father who talked too much about his own generosity. And he had quietly promised himself in his 20s that he would never be that man. He apologized, in the letter, for what he called the arrogance of private virtue for deciding, without asking her, that she did not need to know. He asked her to forgive him for the parts of himself he had hidden, even when the hiding had been well-intentioned. Then he told her about Daniel Hayes. He had met Daniel 6 years before writing the letter, at a moment when Daniel was, in Michael's words, standing at the edge of a cliff he could not see past. He had lost his job at an engineering firm after the company dissolved. His wife, a woman named Patricia, who had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer 18 months earlier, had died that spring, leaving him with a 7-year-old daughter, a mountain of medical debt, a lease he could no longer pay, and a custody challenge from Patricia's family, who believed, not without some kindness in their reasoning, that a man alone and broke was not the best environment for a grieving child. Michael had encountered Daniel through a mutual connection in the nonprofit world, had spent one evening with him listening to the entire story, and had concluded that here was a man of fundamental decency who had simply been placed, by the randomness of circumstance, in a position from which he could not escape without help. He had helped. He had not given Daniel a check with a condition attached, or offered him pity disguised as opportunity. He had made phone calls, called in favors, connected Daniel with a firm that needed a project manager with exactly his skills. He had quietly retained a family attorney and arranged for the legal costs to be covered. He had done it in a way that allowed Daniel to believe, for a time, that it was simply the world turning in his favor, rather than one man turning the world on his behalf. He mentioned Daniel's name in the letter. and then described him as the most quietly courageous person I have met in a long time, a man who kept going for his daughter when any reasonable accounting of his situation would have permitted him to stop. But the letter contained more than the story of Daniel. Beneath the 4 handwritten pages, folded separately and tucked against the bottom of the box, was a document. It was printed, not handwritten, official-looking, formatted with the precision of someone who had worked with lawyers and accountants for decades. It was a proposal, a detailed, fully developed proposal for a private foundation focused on supporting single-parent families in financial crisis, covering housing assistance, legal representation in custody cases, educational grants for children who had lost a parent, and mental health services for families navigating grief and economic disruption simultaneously. The proposal included projected costs, a suggested governance structure, potential partner organizations, and a proposed name, the Michael Carter Foundation. He had written it himself. He had never shown it to anyone. He had never filed it. He had never told Evelyn it existed. And he had placed it in this box, in Daniel Hayes's keeping, alongside a watch and a photograph and a letter, as though he had known or at least allowed for the possibility that someone might need to find it someday, as though completion was something he trusted to the future, rather than demanding of the present. Evelyn stood in the cold afternoon with the document in her hands, and felt something she had not felt in 7 years of grief. The specific, disorienting sensation of being surprised by someone she thought she had entirely known. She looked up at Daniel Hayes. He was watching her with an expression of careful restraint, as though he understood that whatever was happening inside her was not his to narrate. "Did you know about this?" she asked, gesturing at the document. "No," he said. "I didn't know what was in the box. He just told me to give it to you." Lily had found a nearby bench and was sitting on it with her boots swinging, watching a crow that had landed in the grass nearby. The crow regarded her with one bright eye, then walked away. Daniel looked at his daughter for a moment, and then back at Evelyn. "I think," he said carefully, "that he wanted you to be the one to decide what to do with it." Evelyn looked again at the document in her hands, at Michael's neat headers and his careful projections, at the name he had chosen, at the vision he had laid out in plain language, and she understood, in the way that some truths arrive not gradually but all at once, that she was holding the last task he had set for her, not a burden, a continuation. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn Carter did something she had not done since the early months after Michael's death. She went looking, not for distraction, not for the forward motion of productivity, but deliberately backward into files and folders and archived email accounts she had not opened in years, into the notebooks Michael had kept in his desk drawer that she had boxed up and stored in the attic of their house in Cambridge, into financial records that her accountants had categorized and filed away with the clinical efficiency of people who understood numbers and not what the numbers sometimes meant. What she found, over the course of 6 weeks of careful, methodical excavation, was a map of a person she had only partially known. Michael had been giving away money for 15 years, not in the visible, tax-documented, publicly acknowledged way of wealthy people who donate to hospitals and universities and arts organizations and receive their names on buildings in return. He had been doing it quietly, personally, without infrastructure or fanfare. In the way that people sometimes do things they believe are right, without wanting credit for believing them. He had helped pay for a young woman named Sandra Okafor's nursing school tuition after her mother died and her financial aid evaporated. He had covered 6 months of rent for a former Army veteran named Marcus Webb, who was transitioning out of a treatment program and needed time to stabilize before employment was realistic. He had anonymously funded the legal fees for a young man named Thomas Reardon, who had been wrongfully dismissed from his job and lacked the resources to contest it. There were others, a dozen, perhaps more. Small interventions, carefully timed, delivered through intermediaries when possible, so that the recipient often did not know where the help had come from. Only Daniel had known Michael personally. Only Daniel had become something closer to a friend. When Evelyn finally met with Sandra Okafor, who was now a nurse practitioner working at a community health clinic in Worcester, the woman told her something that Evelyn turned over in her mind for many days afterward. "He told me once," Sandra said, "that he had met people who changed their lives, after someone believed in them at exactly the right moment. He said the timing was almost everything. He said most people in crisis aren't drowning because they lack ability. They're drowning because they hit the bottom at the moment when no one happened to be nearby. Evelyn asked her how she had come to know Michael. Sandra said that a colleague of his, she did not know which one, had mentioned her situation to him at a dinner party, entirely in passing, the way people sometimes mention difficult things, without expecting anything to happen. And 2 weeks later, without introduction or explanation, a check had arrived. She had never spoken to him directly. She had written a letter to the return address on the envelope, and no one had ever responded. She had assumed, for years, that the check had come from some organization she could not identify. It was only after reading about his death in the news that she had understood. And by then there was no one to thank. Sandra had kept the original envelope. She brought it to show Evelyn, and Evelyn recognized Michael's handwriting on the return address, labeled the same careful, slightly cramped script as the letter in the wooden box, and something moved in her chest that she chose not to name out loud. Marcus Webb came to meet Evelyn at her office in downtown Boston. He was a large, careful man who chose his words with the deliberateness of someone who has learned that words, spoken carelessly, can be misunderstood. He told her that Michael had found him through a veterans services organization that Michael quietly supported, and that Michael had called him personally, not through an assistant, not by letter, but by phone, and simply asked what he needed. "Nobody asks that," Marcus said, leaning forward slightly. "People ask how you're doing, or they tell you about programs. He just asked what I needed. And when I told him, he said, 'Okay, let me see what I can do,' just like that, like it was simple." Marcus had used the stability of those 6 months to find work at a logistics company where he now managed a team of 12. He said he thought about Michael Carter whenever he had the opportunity to help someone on his own team who was struggling. "I figure," he said, "that's the only way to actually pay it back. You can't pay it back to him, so you pay it forward." He said this without sentimentality, as a practical conclusion he had arrived at through experience, rather than an aspiration he was performing for her benefit. Evelyn appreciated that. She had always trusted people who arrived at kindness through logic, as much as those who arrived at it through feeling. Thomas Reardon, who had become a labor attorney after his own experience with workplace injustice, described Michael Carter as someone who understood that the system was fair in theory and unfair in practice, and who was deeply uninterested in being comfortable with that gap. He said Michael had sent a handwritten note, along with the legal fees, which Thomas still had. The note said only, "I think you're right about what happened. You should fight it." 3 words of assessment, and 3 words of instruction, from a man who had never met him and would never need to know the outcome. Thomas said he had thought about those words many times since becoming an attorney himself, about what it meant to believe someone without requiring proof, and how rarely people in positions of power offered that kind of credence without being asked. "He didn't need to investigate," Thomas said. "He just decided to believe me." That was its own kind of help. There was one more person she found. A woman named Helen Marsh, who ran a small daycare center in Somerville. Helen had written Michael a letter once, years ago, after he had helped her secure the lease on her building, when her original funding fell through at the last hour. She had never expected a response, and Michael had not responded directly. But a month after she sent the letter, a modest but reliable line of annual funding had begun arriving from a private account she could never fully trace. It had kept the center open through 2 recessions and 1 global disruption, and it was still arriving, managed by an attorney Michael had set up on a recurring instruction before his death. Helen had not known where it came from until Evelyn found her. When Helen understood who she was speaking with, she sat for a long moment and then said, very quietly, "I used to pray for that man. I didn't know his name. I just prayed for whoever was on the other end of that kindness." Evelyn did not say anything in response to that. There was nothing adequate to say. She wrote it down instead, in the notebook she had started carrying for this purpose, adding it to the accumulation of small histories that were rearranging her understanding of the man she had grieved for 7 years. She had thought grief was an ending. She was learning it was also, under certain conditions, a form of introduction. It was after these conversations that Evelyn went back to Daniel Hayes. She called him. She had taken his number at the cemetery. In the composed, automatic way, she handled practical matters even in moments of extreme internal disruption, and asked if he would meet her for coffee. He said yes, without hesitation. They met at a place near South Station on a Tuesday afternoon, and Lily was not with him this time. He was quieter without her, or perhaps simply different, less defined by his role, and more visibly himself. A man in his mid-40s, with good manners and careful eyes, who was clearly uncertain, sitting across from this woman he had only recently met. About what exactly was expected of him, Evelyn did not make him guess. She told him what she had found, what she had learned in the weeks of investigation, what the people Michael had helped had told her. She watched his face as she talked, and saw in it the particular expression of someone hearing a story they already knew in outline, but are hearing for the first time in full. When she finished, Daniel was quiet for a long moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, a small habitual motion. "He never told me the scope of it," he said finally. "When he helped me, I thought maybe I was an exception, a one-time thing. I didn't know it was a practice." He paused. "That makes it different, doesn't it?" Evelyn said she thought it did. Then Daniel told her the rest of his own story, the parts he had not said at the cemetery, the parts that required more space and less witness. He told her about the night, 2 weeks after Patricia's funeral, when he had driven to the parking garage off Congress Street at 2 in the morning and sat on the top floor looking out at the city and thought, with the terrible clarity of a man who has slept almost not at all for 3 weeks, that there was possibly no road forward that led anywhere he wanted to go. He had Lily at his mother's house. He had $1,900 in his checking account and $60,000 in medical debt, and a letter from Patricia's parents' attorney about the custody hearing scheduled for the following month. He had a daughter who cried for her mother in the night, and he did not know how to make that better. And he was not sure, at 2 in the morning on that parking garage roof, that he was equal to the task of being both parents at once. He had sat there for 3 hours. He had driven home. He had not known why, entirely, except that the image of Lily's face in the morning, still marked with sleep, had been more real to him than anything else. He had not told anyone about that night. He had not told his own mother, or his brother in Philadelphia, or any of the well-meaning friends who had called in the weeks after the funeral. He had kept it locked in a room inside himself, and had walked carefully around it for years. And he was telling it now, to this woman he had met 1 month ago beside a grave, because somehow the story seemed to belong to this moment, in a way that no earlier moment had provided for. He said that the night on the parking garage had taught him something about the fragility of continuation, about how the difference between a person who goes on and a person who doesn't is sometimes simply whether someone arrived at the right moment. Michael arrived at the right moment, he said. Not that night, but not long after. And because he did, I went on. And because I went on, Lily had her father. He looked across the table at Evelyn. I've thought about that chain a lot, about how small the thing was that he did, in the context of his life. And how enormous it was in the context of mine. Evelyn was quiet for a long time after he said that. Outside the coffee shop, the city went about its business, the noise of traffic and the clatter of someone's luggage on the sidewalk, and 2 men arguing cheerfully about something on the corner. She thought about the wooden box and the sealed letter, and the watch she now wore sometimes on her wrist, because it felt right and a little painful, which is often the nature of the things we carry to honor the dead. She thought about Michael in his office on a winter evening, writing a proposal that no one knew about, building a plan for a future that would only exist if he wasn't there to build it. She thought about what it meant to prepare for your own absence, not with fear, but with intention. He was making sure, she said slowly, that what he cared about would survive him. Daniel nodded. Yeah, he said, I think that's exactly right. And then, quietly but with great precision, he said what Michael had apparently told him years ago, that if anything happened to Michael, Daniel's job was to help take care of what mattered most to Michael. And Daniel had always understood that to be Evelyn. Not in a sentimental or romantic sense, but in the sense that she was the person Michael loved most completely, and she was the one who would be most alone in his absence, and the one who would need, more than money or success or the distraction of work, to know that his love for the world had not stopped at the edge of his own lifetime. "He thought you might need proof," Daniel said simply. "Proof that goodness outlasts the person." Evelyn did not say anything to that. She looked at her coffee and then at the street outside and felt the truth of it move through her without ceremony. The way that things that have been waiting a long time sometimes settle when they finally reach their destination. Spring arrived slowly that year, the way it does in New England, with backtracking and reluctance. A week of warmth followed by a cold snap. The cherry trees fooled twice before they were finally allowed to bloom. Evelyn began to meet with Daniel more regularly. They worked together on the foundation documents, an irony that was not lost on either of them. A woman who had spent 30 years in the business of capital and a man who had spent the last decade in project management, trying to translate a dead man's handwritten proposal into something the state of Massachusetts would recognize as a legal nonprofit entity. It was tedious work. In the way that meaningful things are often tedious at their foundation forms and filings and meetings with attorneys and accountants and potential board members, the slow machinery of intention becoming institution. But there was something in the work that neither of them had expected, which was that it was also simply good. It was the kind of work that ended the day with a clarity that most of Evelyn's professional work did not provide. She had negotiated acquisitions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She had restructured companies and managed crises and made decisions in rooms full of very important people. She had done all of this competently, often brilliantly, and had found in it a version of satisfaction that was real but incomplete, the satisfaction of a problem solved rather than a person helped. The foundation work felt different. It felt, in a way she found difficult to articulate to anyone who had not experienced it. Like doing something for reasons she had chosen herself rather than reasons the world had given her. Lily Hayes, who turned 11 that March, began coming to the office on Saturdays when Daniel brought her along. She was a serious, self-contained child who observed rather than performed, who asked good questions at unexpected moments, and who had apparently decided, after some private assessment, that Evelyn Carter was worthy of her regard. She brought her homework. She sat at a spare desk and worked through it with an industry that Evelyn found quietly admirable. She did not require attention. She did not fill silence unnecessarily. She was the kind of child who seemed to understand, without having been taught it, that some things, some rooms, some afternoons, some people needed to be approached gently, with respect for the weight they were already carrying. One Saturday afternoon, while Daniel was on a call in the conference room, Lily looked up from her math worksheet and said, without preamble, "Did you love him a lot?" Evelyn was reviewing a grant application. She looked up. "Yes," she said. "A very great deal." Lily considered this. "I love my dad a lot," she said. "I think about what it would be like if he wasn't here." She said this matter-of-factly, in the way that children sometimes say deeply significant things when they have been thinking about them alone for a long time. "It's good that he's here," Evelyn said. Lily looked at her math worksheet again. "Yeah," she said. "It is." They were quiet together for a moment, and it was a comfortable quiet, the kind that exists between two people who have independently understood something true and have no need to discuss it further. Evelyn returned to her grant application. Lily erased something on her worksheet and started over. Evelyn noticed the erasing without comment and thought to herself that there was something instructive in the gesture, the willingness to begin again without drama, without grief, simply because the first version had not been quite right. By autumn of that year, the Michael Carter Foundation had made its first grants, 14 families, a total of slightly under $900,000, drawn from an endowment that Evelyn had seeded personally with an amount that would have made the business press speculate wildly had it been made public. She had decided to keep the foundation's funding sources private, at least for now. Not because she was embarrassed, but because Michael had done it that way. And she understood, now, why. There was something in anonymous generosity that protected both the giver and the receiver, the giver from the corruption of recognition, the receiver from the burden of gratitude. The grants covered rent. They covered legal fees. They covered therapy for children who had lost a parent. They covered tuition at community colleges for mothers who were retraining for better-paying work. They were not large, as philanthropic interventions go. They were precise. They arrived, in Daniel's phrase, at the right moment. A community center opened in Dorchester, running after-school programs for children in single-parent households. A scholarship fund was established at 2 local universities specifically for students who had experienced the death of a primary caregiver before the age of 18. A legal clinic was set up in partnership with a law school to provide pro bono representation in custody and housing cases. The foundation did not seek attention. It did not issue press releases. It simply did the work, and the work expanded quietly, the way that genuine things tend to when they are built on actual need rather than the desire to be seen meeting it. There was a ceremony that autumn, small and deliberately understated, for the foundation's launch. Evelyn had insisted on holding it at the cemetery, which had struck the attorney as unconventional and the board members as potentially somber, but which had seemed to Evelyn like the only honest location for it. She stood before Michael's grave one more time, with a small gathering of people behind her: Daniel and Lily, Sandra Okafor and Marcus Webb, and Thomas Reardon, the board, a few of the first-year grant recipients who had agreed to attend and said what she had prepared to say, which was mostly about Michael but also about what it had meant to learn, 7 years late, that a person she had known completely was also someone she had not known at all, and that this had been the most painful and the most extraordinary gift of her life. She said that she had spent 7 years believing that grief was the last thing he had left her. She now understood that grief was only the first thing. The second thing was this. The third thing, she had not yet finished discovering. She looked at the people standing in the cold air around her, at Daniel, with his hands in his coat pockets, at Lily in her red hat, at Sandra, who had driven 2 hours to be there, at Marcus, who stood very straight, with his chin slightly lifted in the way that some people hold themselves when emotion is very close to the surface, and she thought that Michael had been right about something she had resisted for 7 years, that other people were not a consolation for loss. They were a different kind of fullness entirely. Later, when the small group had dispersed and the afternoon was fading again toward the gray of early winter, Evelyn was packing up the materials she had brought when she found, tucked into the interior pocket of the document folder she had carried, an envelope she did not recognize. It was the same cream-colored stock as the first letter, sealed with the same wax. She did not know how it had gotten there. She would eventually learn that Daniel had placed it there at Michael's request years ago. Carrying it in a separate envelope all this time, waiting for a moment that felt right, she stood very still with it in her hands, and she thought for a moment that she might be imagining it. Then she opened it. He had written this one more recently than the first. The handwriting was slightly looser, slightly more hurried, as though he had written it quickly and on purpose. It was dated 3 weeks before the accident. He said that he had found himself thinking, lately, about the future in a way that was specific rather than abstract. He said he did not feel afraid. He felt something more like the urgency of a man who realizes he has been putting off important conversations in favor of manageable ones, and who has decided to stop. He said that the things he most wanted her to know were not complicated, but they were true. He said, "I have watched you manage your grief as though grief were a problem to be solved. And I understand why, because you are the kind of person who solves problems. And I have always loved that about you, but I want you to know that the solving is not required. Some things are meant to be felt and carried and lived with, not resolved." He said, "I believe you have a great deal of life left, and I believe you know how to live it, but I think you may have forgotten that living it well requires other people. Not because you are weak, because you are human." He said, "I have trusted certain things to Daniel Hayes, because I believe he is someone who understands what it means to keep going, and I thought you might need someone near you who also understands that. Not a replacement, not a solution. Just a person who knows the weight." He ended the letter with her name again, just her name, And then a single line. "I arranged for the seeds. I trust you to know when to let them grow." Evelyn stood beside the grave in the cold afternoon, the last light going thin and gold between the trees, the letter folded against her chest with both hands. She did not cry immediately. She had long since moved past the kind of grief that expressed itself easily. What she felt instead was something closer to recognition, the sensation of understanding something she had been circling for a long time without being able to name it. She thought about what it meant to love someone so completely and still discover, years after their death, that you had not known the whole of them. She had thought, for 7 years, that Michael's absence had defined the boundary of what she could know about him. She understood now that absence was only one kind of limit. The other kind, the kind that turned out to be doorways, was the love he had placed in other people, carefully, like objects hidden in a house for someone to find during a long and particular kind of search. She walked back along the familiar path between the headstones, and the gravel was quiet under her feet, and the cold air was clean in a way that November air sometimes is when the light goes. Daniel and Lily were waiting near the gate. Lily had found a stick somewhere, and was writing something in the gravel with its tip, her red hat vivid against the gray. Daniel stood with his hands in his coat pockets, watching Evelyn walk toward them with an expression that was patient and attentive, and held nothing she needed to be afraid of. The three of them moved through the gate together and out into the late afternoon. And when Evelyn looked up, she saw that the cloud cover had opened briefly in the west, the way it sometimes does at the end of a cold day, letting through a band of pale gold light that fell across the road and the bare trees in the ground ahead of them, illuminating nothing dramatic, only the ordinary path. She walked into it without breaking stride. She had been good at continuing. She was finally learning that continuing and healing were not always the same thing, and that the difference between them was, in its own quiet way, everything. Continuing was what she had done for 7 years, the meetings attended, the decisions made, the work completed, the months spent moving forward, because forward was the only available direction. Healing was something else. It was slower and less dignified, and required her to sit with things she had been carefully managing around. It required her to let people know her, not as a chairman or a public figure or a widow of a certain recognized kind, but as a woman who had loved someone very much and had not yet finished learning who that someone was. It required Lily Hayes asking a direct question over a math worksheet and Evelyn answering it honestly. It required Daniel saying something true about weight and having Evelyn hear it as something other than pity. It required, in its patient, unhurried way, the discovery that the life she had organized around loss could be reorganized without betraying anything. Around something else, around the living of it, fully, with other people present, in the way that Michael had always believed she was capable of, and had arranged, in his careful and secretive and loving way, for her to find her way back to. The cemetery gate closed behind them with a soft metallic sound, and the three of them walked toward the cars in the fading light. And the city waited beyond the trees with all its noise and its ordinary persistence, and Evelyn Carter walked into it like a person who has finally understood what she is carrying and has decided, without drama or announcement, to carry it differently. There are people we lose who do not leave in silence. They depart, and their voices go quiet, and the chair at the table stays empty, and the particular warmth of their presence becomes a shape we learn to carry rather than fill. But sometimes they leave something else, not in the obvious places, not in the wills and the property and the photographs, but in the lives of people we have not yet met, in the goodness they dispersed without ceremony across the years of their living. Sometimes we find those people when we least expect to. Sometimes we find them standing at a grave in late October with wildflowers in a child's hand. Having kept a promise across 8 years and several states, having waited without entirely knowing what they were waiting for. And sometimes what we find there, beside all the grief we brought with us, is the evidence that the person we loved was larger than the space they occupied, and that their love was still moving through the world, still arriving at the right moment, still planting what it trusted time and attention to grow. The seeds Michael Carter planted were not dramatic. They were not monuments or institutions or buildings with names on them. They were phone calls made at the right hour. They were checks written without announcement. They were a wooden box carried faithfully across years and state lines by a man who understood, in his bones, what it meant to have been given more time. And now the seeds were flowering in a foundation that bore a dead man's name and did work he had only sketched in a private document that no one was supposed to find for years. In a child who did her homework at a borrowed desk and erased her mistakes without sorrow. In a man who had stood on a parking garage roof at 2 in the morning and driven home. And in a woman who had believed, for 7 years, that the story of the person she loved most was finished. A meeting at a graveside does not always close a love story. Sometimes, if the story was the right kind, it is only the place where the next chapter begins.